In the year 1315, across Europe, something terrible began. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a plague. It was winter. But not just any winter. This was the beginning of what historians now call the Great Famine, and it would last for 7 brutal years. But what most people don't know is what ordinary people had to do just to survive those winters. The choices they made. The things they ate. The lines they crossed. And some of those truths are so dark, so disturbing, that they were deliberately left out of history books for centuries. Winter in medieval times wasn't like winter today. There were no grocery stores. No central heating. No government aid. When the cold came, you either had enough food stored, or you died. It was that simple. But in 1315, something went horribly wrong. The summer before had been cold and wet. Crops failed across England, France, Germany, and beyond. By the time winter arrived, millions of people had almost nothing to eat. And that's when the real nightmare began. Most people today think medieval winters were just about staying warm and waiting for spring. But the reality was far more terrifying. Because when food runs out, and the snow keeps falling, and there's no help coming, humans don't just sit down and accept death. They fight. They adapt. And sometimes, they do things that would make your stomach turn. Let me take you back. Let me show you what winter really meant for a peasant family in 1315. And I'm warning you now, some of this is hard to hear. Before we get to the worst parts, you need to understand how fragile life was back then. In medieval Europe, about 90% of people were peasants. They lived in small villages, worked the land, and survived season to season. Everything depended on the harvest. A normal year went like this. You planted crops in spring, tended them in summer, harvested in autumn, and survived winter on what you stored. Wheat, barley, oats, dried beans, salted pork, maybe some preserved fish if you were lucky. You also hoped your lord, the local nobleman who owned the land, didn't take too much of your harvest as taxes. But even in a good year, winter was dangerous. Peasants lived in small wooden or stone huts with thatched roofs. Most homes had only one room. There was a fire pit in the center, but no chimney, so smoke just filled the room and escaped through gaps in the roof. Families slept together on straw mattresses, often sharing body heat with their animals, because keeping livestock alive was just as important as keeping yourself alive. If your cow died, you lost milk, cheese, and eventually meat. If your chickens died, no more eggs. If your pig died, there went your winter protein. Animals weren't just livestock. They were survival insurance. Now imagine this. It's October 1315. You're a peasant farmer with a wife and 3 children. You've just finished harvesting what little grain managed to grow in the cold, wet summer. But when you count your sacks, your heart sinks. You have maybe half of what you normally store. Maybe less. Your lord's tax collector still shows up. He doesn't care that the harvest failed. He takes his share anyway. Now you're left with even less. You look at your children and you do the math in your head. If you ration carefully, you might have enough to last until February. Maybe March if you're lucky. But spring planting doesn't start until April. And the new harvest won't come until July or August. That's a 4-month gap. 4 months with no food. So what do? First, you start stretching everything. Bread that used to be made with pure wheat flour now gets mixed with ground acorns, sawdust, or even clay to make it last longer. It tastes terrible and barely has any nutrition, but it fills the stomach. You water down the porridge until it's basically just hot water with a few grains floating in it. You give the children smaller portions and tell them to drink more water to feel full. Then you start eating things you wouldn't normally eat. Tree bark becomes a regular part of the diet. You strip it from birch or pine trees, boil it to soften it, and chew it like leather. It's not food, but it gives your jaw something to do and tricks your brain into thinking you've eaten. Some people ground up dried grass or hay and mixed it into their bread. Others ate boiled leather from old shoes or belts. In the city of Tournai, in modern-day Belgium, Chroniclers recorded that people were digging up roots from the frozen ground and eating them raw. In some places, people caught and ate rats, mice, cats, and dogs. Anything with meat on it was fair game. But here's where it gets darker. Animals started disappearing. Not just wild animals. Pets. Horses that were too valuable to eat under normal circumstances were suddenly being slaughtered in secret. In villages across France and England, people began stealing from each other. A chicken here. A sack of grain there. Neighbors who had lived side by side for generations stopped trusting each other. And when that wasn't enough, people turned to something even worse. In the winter of 1316, reports started coming in from multiple regions. At first, they were just whispers. Rumors that nobody wanted to believe. But then the church started investigating. And what they found was horrifying. There were cases, documented cases, of parents abandoning their children in the woods. Not because they didn't love them, but because they couldn't watch them starve. They hoped, maybe, that someone else would find them. Or that they'd somehow survive on their own. Most didn't. In some villages, the elderly began to disappear. At first, people said they had died of cold or hunger, which was probably true. But then there were reports of bodies being found with pieces missing. Flesh cut away from the thighs and arms. At first, people didn't want to believe it. But the evidence kept showing up. In the town of Ypres, now in Belgium, a group of men were caught with human remains in their home. When questioned, they confessed. They had been eating the dead. Not killing people, they claimed, just eating those who had already died. But the line between scavenging the dead and creating the dead is thinner than you think. In Poland, there were reports of people being murdered for their flesh. Travelers going through forests in the winter were warned not to go alone. Some never made it to their destination. In the chronicles of the time, writers described finding bodies along roadsides with limbs missing, stripped of meat like butchered animals. One monk wrote, "Men ate men out of sheer desperation, and the horror of it hung over the land like a curse." This wasn't happening everywhere, and it wasn't the majority of people. But it was happening. And the fact that it was happening at all shows just how far humans can fall when survival is on the line. The church tried to stop it. Priests gave sermons condemning cannibalism as the ultimate sin. But when you're watching your children waste away, when their ribs are showing through their skin and they're too weak to stand, some people stopped caring about sin. They cared about survival. By the winter of 1317, things had gotten so bad that even the kings and nobles were starting to feel it. Castles that were usually well-stocked began to run low on supplies. Royal records from England show that King Edward II ordered emergency grain shipments from abroad, but even that wasn't enough. The ships got delayed by storms. Some sank. Others were raided by pirates or starving villagers before they even reached the ports. In Ireland, the situation was even worse. The English controlled most of the fertile land, and the native Irish were pushed to the margins. When the famine hit, the Irish starved first. Entire villages were wiped out. Some were abandoned completely, left as ghost towns with doors hanging open and bodies still inside. One Irish chronicler wrote, "People died so quickly that the living could not bury the dead. They were left in their homes, in the streets, in the fields, and the wolves came down from the mountains to feed." Wolves. That's another thing people don't talk about. In medieval Europe, wolves were still common. And in normal times, they stayed away from humans. But during the famine, they got bolder. Packs of wolves started coming into villages at night, drawn by the smell of death. They dug up shallow graves and dragged bodies away. In some cases, they attacked the living, especially children or anyone too weak to fight back. There are records of villages organizing night watches just to keep wolves away. Men would stand guard with torches and spears, but many were so weak from hunger they could barely hold their weapons. Some villages were overrun. Survivors would flee to the next town, only to find the same horror waiting for them. And through all of this, winter just kept going. In a normal year, spring would arrive by March. But during the Great Famine, the cold lingered. Snow fell into April. Frost killed early crops. The ground stayed frozen. Even when people tried to plant, nothing would grow. By the time the famine finally ended in 1322, it's estimated that between 10% and 25% of the population of Northern Europe had died. That's millions of people. Entire bloodlines were wiped out. Villages that had existed for centuries vanished from the map. But here's the part that really haunts me. Most history books barely mention this period. When they do, they call it the Great Famine and move on. They don't talk about what people actually did to survive. They don't talk about the cannibalism, the abandonment, the violence, the complete breakdown of society. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. Because it doesn't fit the neat, romanticized version of medieval history that people want to believe. Knights in shining armor, grand castles, noble lords. But the truth is, for most people, medieval life was brutal. And winter could turn that brutality into pure nightmare. The Great Famine wasn't the only time this happened, either. It was just one of the worst. There were smaller famines, local food shortages, harsh winters that killed thousands. And every time, people faced the same impossible choices. By 1318, even the church, which was supposed to be the moral backbone of society, started to crack under the pressure. Monasteries that had once been places of charity and refuge began turning people away. Monks who had taken vows of poverty and service were now hoarding food behind locked doors. Some monasteries hired armed guards to keep starving villagers from breaking in. There are records from a Cistercian monastery in northern France where the abbot wrote in his journal about the guilt he felt. Every morning, dozens of people would gather outside the gates, begging for scraps. Women holding dying babies. Old men who could barely stand. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition. And every morning, the abbot ordered the gates to stay closed. He wrote, "God forgive me, but if we feed them, we will starve ourselves. And then who will be left to pray for their souls?" That's the kind of calculation people were making. Cold, brutal math. Your life or theirs. In cities, it was even worse. When you're in a village, at least you might know how to forage, how to hunt, how to find something, anything to eat. But in medieval cities like Paris, London, or Florence, people were packed together in tight streets with no access to farmland. When the food supply broke down, there was nowhere to go. The price of bread skyrocketed. In England, the cost of wheat increased by 800% in some areas. That means a loaf of bread that used to cost 1 penny now cost 8. And most people didn't have 8 pennies. They didn't even have one. Bakers were accused of hoarding grain and selling it on the black market. Some were attacked by mobs. A few were killed. In Paris, riots broke out in the winter of 1316. Crowds of starving people stormed bakeries and granaries, taking whatever they could find. The city guards tried to stop them, but many of the guards were just as hungry. Some joined the riots. Others just looked the other way. King Philip V of France tried to control the chaos by setting price limits on grain, but it didn't work. Merchants just stopped selling. They hid their supplies and waited for the prices to go back up. Meanwhile, people kept dying in the streets. One account from a Parisian priest describes walking through the city at dawn and counting over 30 bodies in a single district. Most were children. He wrote, "They looked like little skeletons wrapped in rags. Their eyes were open, staring at nothing. I prayed over them, but I do not know if God was listening." And this wasn't just happening in one city or one country. This was happening across the entire continent. From Scotland to Italy, from Ireland to Poland, people were facing the same nightmare. It was like the whole world had turned cold and cruel at the same time. But let's go back to the villages, because that's where the truly dark stuff happened. The stuff that makes you realize just how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. In rural England, There's a documented case from 1317 in a village called Woodstock. A man named William was caught stealing a sack of oats from his neighbor's barn. Normally, theft like that might get you a beating or a fine. But during the famine, people weren't in a forgiving mood. The neighbor and his sons dragged William into the village square and beat him to death in front of everyone. No trial. No priest. Just rage and hunger. And nobody stopped them. In fact, some people joined in. Because in their minds, William wasn't just a thief. He was taking food out of their children's mouths. He was a threat to everyone's survival. So they killed him, and then they took back the oats and split them among the families who had helped. The lord of the manor heard about it later, but he didn't do anything. What was he going to do? Arrest half the village? He could barely keep order as it was. So he let it go. And that's when people realized that the law didn't really matter anymore. All that mattered was food. Once that realization set in, things got even darker. There are records from multiple villages across Europe of something that historians call survival hierarchies. Basically, families decided who got to eat and who didn't. And it usually went like this. The father ate first, because he was the one who could work and bring in resources. Then the oldest sons, because they could help with labor. Then the mother, but only barely enough to keep her alive. And last, if there was anything left, the daughters and younger children. This wasn't cruelty. This was cold calculation. If the father died, the whole family died. So he had to eat. But if a young child died, well, that was one less mouth to feed, and maybe the others would survive. There are heartbreaking accounts of mothers watching their children slowly starve, knowing they could give them their own portion of food, but also knowing that if they did, they wouldn't have the strength to care for the others. Some women made that sacrifice anyway. Others didn't. And the ones who didn't had to live with that choice for the rest of their lives. In some families, there were whispers of something even worse. Infanticide. The deliberate killing of newborns or very young children to save resources. It's impossible to know how often this happened, because nobody wrote it down. Nobody wanted to admit it. But in a few rare cases, priests mentioned it in their records, usually in confession logs that were sealed for centuries. One priest in Germany wrote about a woman who confessed to smothering her infant daughter because she couldn't produce enough milk to feed her, and she already had 3 other children. The priest wrote that he didn't know what penance to give her, because he couldn't imagine the hell she was already living in. And it wasn't just the peasants suffering. Let's talk about what was happening in the castles and manor houses, because even the wealthy weren't immune. Medieval nobles lived better than peasants, obviously. They had stone walls, large fireplaces, and access to more resources. But during the Great Famine, even they started to feel the squeeze. The nobles depended on the peasants to grow food and pay taxes. But when the peasants had nothing, the nobles got nothing. Lords started hoarding whatever food they had. Some locked themselves in their estates and refused to come out. Others tried to help their people, but quickly realized they didn't have enough to make a difference. A few lords actually sold off land, jewelry, and family heirlooms just to buy grain from abroad. But even that didn't last long. There's a record from an English nobleman named Lord Berkeley who wrote to the king in 1316, begging for help. He said his entire estate was on the edge of collapse. His tenants couldn't pay rent because they had no crops. His livestock were dying from lack of feed. And his own household was down to eating 1 meal a day. He wrote, "If this continues, I will have nothing left but stones and bones." And some nobles didn't just sit and wait. They turned violent. In France, there were reports of minor lords raiding each other's estates, stealing grain and livestock. In one case, a dispute over a granary led to a full-blown skirmish between 2 noble families. Several men died. And all of it was over food. The feudal system, the whole structure of medieval society, started to break down. Peasants who survived began to question why they should keep working for lords who couldn't protect or feed them. Some ran away to the cities, hoping to find work or charity. Others formed bandit groups and started robbing travelers. In the forests of Germany and France, these bandit groups became a serious problem. They weren't professional criminals. They were just desperate people who had lost everything. Farmers, craftsmen, even former soldiers. They would ambush merchants, steal whatever they were carrying, and disappear back into the woods. One chronicler described a band of outlaws in the Black Forest who were so hungry, they attacked a group of pilgrims traveling to a monastery. The pilgrims had almost nothing, just a few loaves of bread and some dried fish. But the bandits killed them anyway and took everything. When authorities finally caught the bandits weeks later, they found them half-starved in a cave, still clutching the stolen food. And here's the thing that really gets me. All of this, the violence, the cannibalism, the abandonment, the total breakdown of morality, it all happened because of weather. That's it. A few years of cold, wet summers and harsh winters, and the entire social order collapsed. It makes you realize how fragile everything is. We like to think we're civilized, that we've moved past this kind of brutality. But the truth is, we're only ever 3 missed meals away from chaos. The only difference between us and those medieval peasants is that we have systems in place, supply chains, governments, infrastructure. But if those systems ever failed, if the trucks stopped delivering food, if the power grids went down, how long do you think it would take before people started making the same choices? By 1320, the worst of the famine had passed. The weather started to improve. Crops began to grow again. Slowly, painfully, life started to return to normal. But the scars remained. Entire villages were gone. Families had been torn apart. And the people who survived carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. There are records of people decades later still talking about the Great Hunger. Parents would tell their children stories, not to scare them, but to make sure they never forgot. This is what can happen, they'd say. This is why you never waste food. This is why you always prepare for winter. But eventually, those stories faded. Generations passed. The horror became history, and history became legend, and legend became forgotten. And that's why most people today have no idea just how brutal medieval winters could be. The truth is, for most of human history, winter wasn't just a season. It was a test. A brutal, unforgiving test of whether you were strong enough, smart enough, and ruthless enough to survive. And for millions of people, the answer was no.